A millionaire saves a black boy's life in the middle of a burning building, never expecting to see him again. But 22 years later, that same boy walks into a courtroom and completely turns his world upside down. He's no longer a scared child. He's the only person who can clear the millionaire's name, right when the world believes he's guilty of everything. What happened in those missing years? And why does this young man risk everything to defend the stranger who once saved him? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Isaiah Freeman's fingers moved across the paper, sketching bold lines that transformed into a caped hero with determination in his eyes. The living room was small, barely big enough for their worn couch and the coffee table where he sat cross-legged on the carpet. But it was home. His mom always said it wasn't the size that mattered. It was the love inside that counted. "Baby, you want extra cheese in yours?" Latrice called from the kitchen, the familiar sound of a wooden spoon scraping against their only pot mixing with the building's constant symphony of sounds. "Yes, please." Isaiah didn't look up from his drawing, his tongue poking out slightly as he concentrated on getting the hero's mask just right. The flickering hallway light outside their apartment door cast dancing shadows through the gap underneath, and somewhere above them, Mrs. Johnson's TV was playing her favorite game show a little too loud. The apartment building hummed with life, voices arguing about basketball scores, children running down halls, the ancient elevator groaning as it carried residents up and down. Isaiah was so used to these sounds that they felt like background music to his life. Latrice appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her waitress uniform. Her eyes were tired from her double shift, but her smile was warm as sunshine when she looked at her son's artwork. "Another superhero, baby? Show me this one." Isaiah held up his drawing proudly. He saves people from fires and bad guys. See his cape? It's fireproof. "That's beautiful, baby." Latrice's voice was soft with love. She glanced at the clock and frowned slightly. "I need to check on Mrs. Martinez upstairs real quick. She wasn't feeling good earlier. You stay right here, okay? Don't open the door for anyone. Don't touch the stove. Just keep drawing. I'll be back in 5 minutes. Promise. Cross my heart." Latrice made the gesture, then kissed his forehead. 5 minutes, that's all." Isaiah nodded, already reaching for a fresh piece of paper. He barely registered the sound of the door clicking shut behind his mother when the first wail of the fire alarm pierced the air. At first, he thought it was just another false alarm. They had lots of those in Southside Towers. But then, the acrid smell of smoke began seeping under the door. His heart started racing. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant danger. The superhero on his paper stared back at him, unable to help. Isaiah grabbed his sketchbook. It had all his best drawings, and his inhaler from the coffee table. His chest was already feeling tight. The hallway was filling with smoke when he opened the door. People were running, shouting. Someone pushed past him, making him stumble. "Mama?" he called out, but his voice was lost in the chaos. The smoke was getting thicker. The elevator doors stood open like a metal mouth. Isaiah ran inside, hitting the lobby button repeatedly with a shaking finger. The doors closed and the elevator lurched downward. Then, with a horrible grinding sound, it stopped. The lights flickered. Smoke began pouring in through the ventilation grates. Isaiah's inhaler slipped from his trembling hands, falling through the narrow grating in the floor. "No! No! No!" He dropped to his knees, trying to reach it, but it was gone. His chest tightened more. The smoke was getting worse. He crawled to the corner, pulling his t-shirt over his nose, but it didn't help much. His eyes burned. His lungs felt like they were on fire. The sketchbook clutched to his chest was the only familiar thing in this nightmare. Through the haze, he thought he heard people screaming outside. Across the street, Darius Langford was inspecting a property he planned to renovate when the commotion started. He stepped outside to see smoke pouring from Southside Towers, People were gathering on the street, phones raised to record the disaster. The sound of sirens was still distant. "There's a kid stuck in the elevator," someone shouted. "I saw him go in." Darius didn't hesitate. He sprinted across the street, his expensive shoes pounding against the pavement. The smoke hit him like a wall as he entered the building. He could hear the elevator's emergency bell ringing weakly between floors. "Where's the fire extinguisher?" he shouted. Someone pointed to a red case on the wall. Darius smashed the glass with his elbow, ignoring the sting as shards cut his skin. He grabbed the heavy extinguisher and ran to the elevator doors. The metal was hot when he wedged the extinguisher between them. Muscles straining, he forced them open inch by inch. Smoke billowed out. Through the gap, he could see a small figure curled in the corner, motionless. Darius shrugged off his suit jacket and squeezed through the opening. The boy was unconscious, a sketchbook still clutched in his small hands. Working quickly, Darius wrapped him in the jacket and lifted him up. The smoke was so thick now he could barely see. He carried Isaiah out, past the crowd still filming with their phones, past the arriving fire trucks with their flashing lights. His lungs burned, but he didn't stop until he reached the paramedics. "He needs help," Darius gasped, laying Isaiah gently on a stretcher. He was in there too long. The paramedics swarmed around them, placing an oxygen mask over Isaiah's face. Someone tried to interview Darius, shoving a microphone in his face, but he backed away, disappearing into the growing crowd. Before he turned away completely, he leaned close to the unconscious boy one last time. "Make it count, kid," he whispered. "That's all I ask." In the chaos of sirens and shouts, of firefighters rushing into the building and more residents running out, no one noticed the businessman walking away, his white shirt smudged with soot, his expensive suit jacket left behind, wrapped around a small boy who still held his sketchbook of heroes. Isaiah's world faded in and out as the ambulance raced through the streets. The last thing he registered was the feel of the suit jacket covering him, still warm from the man who had saved him, and those whispered words echoing in his mind before everything went black. The hospital room was too bright and too quiet. The only sounds were the steady beep of machines and the soft scratch of Isaiah's pencil against paper. The suit jacket draped across his lap was much too big for him, but he refused to let anyone take it away. It still smelled faintly of smoke and something else, something expensive, like the cologne his mother's boss wore when he visited the restaurant where she worked. The social worker at the foot of his bed kept shifting, the plastic chair squeaking beneath her. Her name was Ms. Thompson, and she had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She'd been sitting there for 20 minutes, waiting for Isaiah to say something, anything, after she'd told him about his mother. "Isaiah, honey," Ms. Thompson said softly. "I know this is very hard to understand right now." Isaiah's pencil moved faster across the paper. The figure taking shape wasn't like his usual superheroes with capes and masks. This one wore a suit jacket like the one in his lap. The hero was breaking through flames, arms outstretched, determined. "Would you like to talk about what you're drawing?" Ms. Thompson tried again. Isaiah added more details to the blazer, making sure to get the shoulders just right. He remembered how broad they'd looked when the man carried him out. His mother had always told him that art was a way to tell stories when words weren't enough. The next few days passed in a blur of doctors, nurses, and more social workers. Isaiah didn't speak. He drew, page after page filled with the same figure, the hero in the blazer, saving people from fires, breaking down doors, carrying children to safety. The temporary foster home was a 2-story house with peeling white paint and a creaky front porch. Mrs. Chen, the foster mother, showed Isaiah to a small room he'd share with 2 other boys. The beds were neatly made, but the walls were bare. No drawings, no family photos, nothing like home. "Dinner's at 6, Mrs. Chen said kindly. "Try to settle in, okay?" That night, when the house was quiet and his roommates were asleep, Isaiah sat cross-legged on his bed with a flashlight. He carefully examined the suit jacket he'd refused to part with. His fingers found the inside pocket, and there, stitched into the expensive fabric, was a tag: Darius Langford, Langford Properties. Isaiah traced the letters with his finger. Now the hero in his drawings had a name. He tucked the jacket under his pillow, keeping the discovery to himself like a precious secret. The Chen household ran on strict schedules. Breakfast at 7, homework after school, chores before dinner. The other foster kids were nice enough, but Isaiah remained silent. He watched the front door every afternoon, hoping to see a tall figure in a suit, but Darius never came. Mrs. Chen tried to get him to talk. She sat with him while he drew, offered him extra helpings at dinner, and gave him fresh paper when his sketchbook was full. But the house felt cold despite her efforts. Too many children moving through like shadows, too many empty spaces where family photos should be. In a luxurious hotel room across town, Darius Langford sat in the dark, the TV's blue light flickering across his face. He flipped through news channels, searching for any mention of the fire, of the boy he'd saved. But his name wasn't there. He'd disappeared before anyone could identify him. The ice in his whiskey glass clinked as he set it down. He should be relieved. No press meant no complications. But the image of the small boy clutching that sketchbook wouldn't leave his mind. "He's safe now," Darius muttered to himself, running a hand over his tired face. "That's what matters." But the words felt hollow in the empty room. He should have done more. Should have stayed. Should have made sure the boy had someone. The thought of those big, frightened eyes in the smoke-filled elevator haunted him. Darius picked up his phone, thumb hovering over the number for social services. But what would he say? What right did he have to interfere? He was just a man who happened to be there. The boy needed family, not a stranger who'd done one good deed. He put the phone down and turned off the TV. 2 weeks after the fire, Isaiah sat on his temporary bed, carefully packing his few belongings. Another foster home waited. Mrs. Chen helped him fold the suit jacket that still seemed to swallow him whole. "You'll take good care of this, won't you?" she asked, smoothing the expensive fabric. Isaiah nodded. He placed his mother's photo, the one from her last birthday, where she was laughing in her waitress uniform, on top of the jacket. His sketchbook, filled with drawings of the hero named Darius, went in last. The social worker's car was warm, but Isaiah shivered anyway. As they pulled away from the Chen house, he hugged his backpack close. The jacket inside still carried a trace of that expensive cologne, mixed now with the lingering scent of smoke and hospital disinfectant. Looking out the window at the passing streets, Isaiah whispered words so quietly that even he could barely hear them. "I'll make it count." The years after the fire blurred together like watercolors in Isaiah's sketchbook. Foster homes came and went, each one leaving its own distinct mark on his growing understanding of survival. The first was a cramped apartment with 4 other kids, where he learned to eat quickly before the food disappeared. The second was a strict household where children were seen but never heard, perfect for someone who'd already mastered silence. By 8, Isaiah had perfected the art of becoming invisible. He could read a room's mood by the way footsteps echoed down hallways. He knew which adults meant their smiles and which ones were just collecting government checks. His sketchbook became his constant companion, filled with increasingly detailed drawings of the man in the blazer, sometimes fighting fires, sometimes standing tall in courtrooms, always protecting others. The jacket stayed pristine, carefully sealed in a vacuum bag that Isaiah had bought with saved-up allowance money. He kept it under whatever bed was currently his, moving it from home to home like a sacred artifact. Sometimes, late at night, he'd pull out the bag just to look at it through the clear plastic, remembering the weight of it around his shoulders in the ambulance. School became his sanctuary. While other kids struggled with fractions and book reports, Isaiah devoured knowledge like it was air. Teachers noticed his quiet intelligence, the way he could solve complex problems without showing his work. But making friends was harder. He kept to himself, eating lunch in the library, sketching during recess. The third foster home had too many rules. The fourth had too few. The fifth lasted only 2 months before the couple divorced. The sixth might have worked, but the mother got sick and couldn't keep fostering. Isaiah learned to pack light and never fully unpack. Everything changed when he met Tamika. He was 13, she was 15, and they were placed in the same foster home, a decent place run by a retired teacher named Ms. Jackson. Tamika took one look at Isaiah's careful way of moving through the world and recognized a kindred spirit. "You're too quiet," she told him on his third day, plopping down beside him on the back porch where he was sketching. "But I get it. System kids like us, we learn to watch before we talk." Isaiah looked up from his drawing, studying her face for any sign of mockery. He found none. Just understanding in her dark eyes and a hint of protective fierceness in the set of her jaw. "Nice art," she said, peering at his sketchbook. "Who's the guy in the suit?" Isaiah almost closed the book. He never showed anyone his drawings of Darius, but something about Tamika's direct gaze made him pause. "Someone who saved my life," he said softly, his voice rough from disuse. Tamika didn't push for more. Instead, she started telling him about the charter school she attended, how it was different from regular public school. "They actually care if you learn," she explained. "You're smart enough to get in. I've seen your report cards." Over the next few months, Tamika became the sister Isaiah never had. She helped him with applications, coached him through the entrance interview, and celebrated wildly when he got accepted to her school. More importantly, she understood his silences, his need to keep the jacket safe, his drive to excel. "You're not just smart," she told him after watching him destroy the competition in his first debate tournament. "You've got fire in you. You just hide it well." The charter school opened new worlds for Isaiah. In debate club, his careful observation of people became a strength. He could read opponents' tells, anticipate their arguments, and respond with quiet but devastating precision. Mock trial was even better. Something about the structured combat of the courtroom called to him, like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. At 16, Isaiah was browsing the business section of the library's newspaper archive for a school project when he saw it, a small article about urban development featuring Darius Langford. The photo showed an older version of the man from his drawings, silver threading through his dark hair, standing in front of a new community center his company had funded. Isaiah's hands shook as he carefully cut out the article. He slipped it into his sketchbook, between pages of the hero he'd been drawing for a decade. He'd thought about reaching out before, had even drafted letters he never sent. But what would he say? "Remember me? The kid from the fire?" He didn't want pity or publicity. He wanted to prove that Darius's faith in him that day hadn't been misplaced. The acceptance letter from Columbia arrived on a rainy Tuesday during his senior year. Full scholarship. Isaiah stared at the thick envelope, remembering all the nights he'd studied while other foster kids watched TV, all the weekends he'd spent in debate tournaments instead of parties. Tamika found him still holding the letter an hour later. She took one look at his face and knew. "You did it, little brother," she whispered, pulling him into a fierce hug. Her tears fell hot on his shoulder, but her voice was strong. "You really did it." The morning of his departure, Isaiah stood in his bedroom at Ms. Jackson's house, looking at the vacuum-sealed jacket he'd kept safe for 12 years. With careful movements, he broke the seal and lifted out the blazer. It still held its shape perfectly, the expensive fabric barely aged. He folded it with precise movements, smoothing each crease. At the airport, Tamika hugged him so tight he could barely breathe. "You call me when you land," she ordered, her voice thick with emotion. "And you better come back for holidays." "I will," Isaiah promised, meaning it. She was family now, the only real family he had. As he settled into his seat on the plane, Isaiah placed his carry-on bag carefully under the seat in front of him. Inside, nestled between his laptop and a new sketchbook, lay the folded jacket, no longer sealed away, but ready to face whatever came next. The afternoon sun filtered through the high windows of courtroom 4B, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Isaiah Freeman stood before the jury, his presence commanding, yet controlled. His tailored gray suit fit perfectly, a far cry from the oversized blazer that had once wrapped around his 6-year-old frame. "My client, Mrs. Denise Taylor, has lived in the Riverside Apartments for 15 years, Isaiah began, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. "She's raised 3 children there. She's never missed a rent payment until 3 months ago, when her youngest son's medical bills forced an impossible choice between medication and housing." He moved with measured steps, making eye contact with each juror. The fluorescent lights caught the subtle gray threading at his temples, earned early from years of carrying others' burdens. "The property management company would have you believe this is a simple matter of numbers. Missed payments equal automatic eviction. But our laws recognize that humanity can't be reduced to spreadsheets. Mrs. Taylor didn't choose to have her hours cut at work. She didn't choose for her son to need emergency surgery." In the gallery, Denise Taylor sat straight-backed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her oldest daughter, barely 16, held her mother's shoulder with quiet strength. "When we talk about justice," Isaiah continued, his tone deepening with conviction, "we must ask ourselves, what serves the greater good? Forcing a family onto the streets over a temporary setback, or allowing a dedicated mother who has proven her reliability over 15 years the opportunity to catch up on payments through the structured plan we've presented?" The jury's verdict came back in less than an hour, ruling in favor of Mrs. Taylor. The property management company would have to accept the payment plan. As the Taylor family embraced tearfully near the courthouse steps, Isaiah packed his briefcase with efficient movements, allowing himself a small smile. Later that afternoon, sunlight slanted through the blinds of Isaiah's office at the Legal Equity Center. The space was modest but meticulously organized, with neat stacks of case files and a wall of legal references. A single framed sketch hung behind his desk, a man in a blazer breaking through flames, drawn by much younger hands. His cell phone buzzed. Tameka's name flashed on the screen. "Little brother." Her voice carried its usual mix of sass and warmth. "Just saw your name pop up on Justice Watch blog. Rising star public defender saves family from corporate eviction. You're making waves again." Isaiah leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie. "Just doing my job, Tameka. Please, you're fighting the good fight and you know it, but you sound tired. When's the last time you took a real break?" Says the journalist who sleeps with her phone under her pillow, Isaiah countered, but there was affection in his voice. "I'm fine. Got a mentoring session at the community center tonight. Those kids keep me going. Just don't burn yourself out. You can't save everyone. I can try." After saying goodbye to Tameka, Isaiah gathered materials for his mentoring session. The community center was bustling with activity when he arrived. In a bright classroom, 12 teenagers sat around tables arranged like a courtroom, their faces eager and uncertain. "All right," Isaiah said, setting down his bag. "Who's ready to argue their first case?" Across town, in a quiet corner of an upscale restaurant, Darius Langford sat across from his longtime friend and legal advisor, James Chen. At 54, Darius carried his age well. Though stress had carved deep lines around his eyes, his suit was expensive but understated, his manner reserved. "The youth legal program you funded is showing excellent results," James said, reviewing papers between bites. "Graduation rates are up, and 3 alumni are heading to law school this fall." Darius nodded, satisfaction briefly lighting his features. "Keep my name off the records. Let the program speak for itself." "Always do. Though I still think you could do more good by being more public about your philanthropy. Might help balance out some of the old reputation." "No." Darius's tone was firm, but tired, an old argument. "The work matters, not the credit." That evening, Isaiah sat cross-legged on his apartment floor, surrounded by case files. The TV provided background noise until a breaking news alert cut through his concentration. He looked up to see a familiar face filling the screen. Breaking news. Real estate mogul Darius Langford under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and mass displacement. Federal authorities have launched a probe into allegations spanning 2 decades. Isaiah's breath caught in his throat. The case files slipped from his fingers. On the screen, photos showed a man he'd drawn 1,000 times, whose jacket still hung in his closet. The face was older, grayer, but unmistakable. "That's him," Isaiah whispered, his voice barely audible over the newscaster's continued reporting. Miles away, in a spacious but darkened living room, Darius Langford sat alone in his leather armchair. The same news report played on his wall-mounted screen, casting harsh shadows across his stunned expression. Headlines crawled relentlessly across the bottom of the screen. Investigation reveals pattern of suspicious transactions. Displaced residents claim systematic targeting. Langford properties facing multiple federal probes. The remote control lay untouched on the armrest. Darius made no move to change the channel or turn off the TV. He simply watched, his face a mask of disbelief as decades of careful work began to unravel in prime time. The morning sun had barely crept over the city skyline when Isaiah pushed through the glass doors of the Legal Equity Center. The usual morning quiet was replaced by an unusual buzz of activity. Paralegals hurried between cubicles with stacks of papers, and the conference room lights were already blazing. Marcus Chen, one of the senior attorneys, intercepted Isaiah before he could reach his office. "Emergency meeting in 10 minutes," he said, passing Isaiah a thick manila folder. "Something big just landed." Isaiah nodded, heading to his desk to drop off his messenger bag. The office TV was tuned to the morning news, still running coverage of the Langford investigation. Isaiah forced himself to look away, focusing instead on organizing his files for the day's regular cases. Sarah Rodriguez, their case coordinator, poked her head around his doorframe. "Did you see the folder?" Her dark eyes were wide with excitement. "Jameson and Burke reached out this morning. They're overwhelmed with high-profile cases and need to outsource some clients to partner firms." "And we got picked?" Isaiah raised an eyebrow, finally opening the folder on his desk. "They specifically requested us, said they needed a team known for finding truth, not just winning cases." Sarah leaned against the doorframe. "Plus, their client specifically asked for a firm with a track record of fairness over flash." Isaiah's eyes scanned the first page. His hand froze mid-motion when he saw the name. Darius Langford versus United States of America. "Conference room in 2, Sarah called over her shoulder as she hurried away. The morning meeting was packed. Every chair around the long table was filled, with junior attorneys and paralegals lining the walls. Marcus stood at the head of the table, laying out the situation. Darius Langford's assets have been frozen pending investigation. His regular legal team has withdrawn, citing irreconcilable differences in their approach to defense. Marcus's laser pointer highlighted key points on the projected screen. "He's requesting representation through our partnership with the Fair Defense Initiative." "Wait," Jennifer Park, a third-year associate, interrupted. "A billionaire real estate mogul wants public defense." "He's not technically requesting public defense," Sarah clarified. "The initiative provides sliding-scale representation for defendants who claim innocence but can't access their usual resources. Mr. Langford has specifically requested a team without ties to his previous business circles." Isaiah sat quietly, his fingers pressed against the cool surface of the conference table. The room felt suddenly too warm, too close. His collar seemed to tighten around his throat. Marcus continued outlining the charges: systematic fraud spanning 2 decades, embezzlement through a complex network of shell companies, intentional displacement of vulnerable communities through manipulated property values. The evidence looked comprehensive: financial records, witness statements, internal communications. The prosecution is painting this as a calculated scheme, Marcus explained. They're claiming Langford Properties deliberately targeted struggling neighborhoods, artificially drove down property values, then used shell companies to buy at rock-bottom prices before renovating and flipping for massive profits. Isaiah's chest tightened. The description didn't match the man who'd run into a burning building to save a child he didn't know. But memory was a tricky thing, especially memories from childhood trauma. We need to decide if we're taking this case, Marcus concluded. It's high profile, complex, and could affect our reputation either way. The room erupted in discussion. Isaiah stood quietly and stepped out, needing air. He found himself in the small courtyard behind the building, breathing deeply, trying to sort through the tumult of emotions. Sarah followed him out. "You okay? You're usually first to weigh in on big cases." "I'm fine," Isaiah said, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "Just processing." "I can take point on this one if you want. You've got a full caseload already." Isaiah turned to face her, his expression carefully neutral. "I'll consult, just for now." That evening, long after his colleagues had gone home, Isaiah sat at his desk surrounded by case documents. He'd been through every page twice, making careful notes, looking for patterns. The prosecution's case seemed airtight, almost too perfect. He studied timeline charts tracking property acquisitions and sales. The numbers aligned exactly with the prosecution's claims. Shell companies appeared and dissolved at suspicious intervals. Everything pointed to guilt. And yet, Isaiah pulled up archived news articles about Langford Properties from the past 20 years. Hidden beneath the major headlines about property deals were smaller stories: anonymous donations to community centers, quiet funding for youth programs, mysterious grants to legal aid organizations. The evidence suggested a man systematically destroying communities for profit. But these smaller stories painted a different picture, one of someone trying to give back without fanfare. Something felt off about the whole case. The prosecution's evidence was too clean, too perfectly arranged. In Isaiah's experience, real fraud was messy, with loose ends and inconsistencies. This felt more like a carefully constructed narrative than organic evidence. The cleaning crew's vacuum in the hallway finally broke his concentration. Isaiah looked up to find night had fallen. His suit jacket lay draped over a chair, and his tie hung loose around his neck. The walk home took him past the courthouse, its marble facade gleaming under streetlights. Isaiah's apartment was modest but comfortable, with walls lined with law books and framed artwork, mostly his own sketches from over the years. He hung his blazer by the door and moved to his study. The bottom drawer of his desk was locked, requiring both a key and a combination. Inside lay a worn sketchbook, its pages yellow with age. Isaiah settled into his chair and carefully opened the book. Past drawings of superheroes and courtroom scenes, he found what he was looking for: a carefully preserved photograph of a jacket label, the stitching still clear after all these years. Darius Langford, Langford Properties. His finger traced the photographed letters as he whispered into the quiet room, "If you're the man I remember, this isn't you." The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the temporary law office, casting long shadows across the minimalist furniture. Isaiah adjusted his tie as he followed Marcus and Sarah through the glass doors. The space felt stark, rented conference rooms stripped down to essentials, a far cry from the luxury Darius Langford must have been accustomed to. They found Darius sitting at a simple wooden table, reviewing documents with two junior attorneys from Jameson and Burke. He looked different from his news photos, more human somehow. His silver hair was slightly disheveled, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. The crisp suit he wore seemed to hang a touch loose on his frame. "Mr. Langford," Marcus began, "I'd like you to meet our team. This is Sarah Rodriguez, our case coordinator, and Isaiah Freeman, one of our senior attorneys." Darius stood, offering a firm handshake to each of them. His grip was steady, professional. When he reached Isaiah, their eyes met briefly. Isaiah searched for any hint of recognition, any flicker of memory, but found only polite acknowledgement. "Thank you all for taking the time," Darius said. His voice carried the same quiet authority Isaiah remembered from that night, the voice that had whispered through smoke and darkness. But now it held a weight of exhaustion. They settled around the table, spreading out files and laptops. Sarah began with standard preliminary questions about Darius's background and role at Langford Properties. Isaiah watched silently, noting how Darius answered each question with careful consideration. "I understand you stepped back from day-to-day operations last year," Sarah said, reviewing her notes. "Can you tell us about that decision?" Darius nodded, his fingers absently straightening a stack of papers. "I was diagnosed with stage 3 colorectal cancer in March. The treatment protocol was aggressive. Surgery followed by combined radiation and chemotherapy." He paused, swallowing hard. "I had to delegate most of my responsibilities to my executive team, primarily to Glenn Avery, my CFO of 15 years. Isaiah noticed how Darius's shoulders tensed slightly at mentioning Avery's name. "And during your treatment, how involved were you in company decisions?" "Minimally," Darius admitted. His face showed a flash of what looked like genuine regret. "I trusted Glenn implicitly. We'd worked together since he was a junior analyst. I believed—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I should have maintained better oversight." Marcus leaned forward. "The prosecution claims you personally authorized the creation of multiple shell companies between 2020 and 2022. Can you speak to that?" "I signed whatever Glenn put in front of me during that period," Darius said quietly. "I was in and out of the hospital, dealing with complications. The paperwork he brought seemed routine. Property acquisitions, standard corporate restructuring. I never saw anything about shell companies." Isaiah had been studying Darius's body language throughout the exchange. The man's responses felt unrehearsed, his remorse genuine. But Isaiah needed to be certain. "Did you sign the displacement orders for the tenants at Brooklyn Court?" Isaiah asked abruptly, his voice cutting through the formal atmosphere. Everyone at the table tensed slightly at the direct question. Darius turned to face Isaiah fully, his blue eyes sharp despite his fatigue. "No," he said firmly. "I didn't even know about the evictions until after my final round of treatment. Glenn told me it was a standard renovation project. When I learned the truth, that families had been forced out with barely any notice." Real pain flickered across his features. "That's not how we operate. It's not what I built this company to do." Isaiah watched as Darius's hand clenched slightly on the table. The reaction wasn't performative. It carried the weight of genuine distress. "Those tenants," Darius continued, his voice rougher now. "Some had lived there for decades. We had protocols in place for renovation projects, generous relocation packages, minimum 6 months notice, assistance finding new housing. I would never have approved mass evictions like that." The meeting continued for another hour, covering financial records and corporate communications. Throughout it all, Isaiah observed how Darius handled each document with care, how he took time to consider each question before answering. There was none of the defensive posturing typical of white-collar defendants. As they wrapped up, Darius stood and reached for his coat, which hung on a nearby rack. Isaiah watched as he lifted it with a gentle touch, folding it carefully over his arm. The motion triggered a vivid memory. Smoke-filled air, a small boy wrapped in an expensive jacket, the same careful handling of the fabric despite the chaos around them. Isaiah's breath caught slightly. The parallel was unmistakable, but he kept his face neutral, gathering his papers without comment. Now wasn't the time to reveal their connection. He needed to be certain first, certain that the man who'd saved his life was the same man who sat before him now, certain that Darius Langford was still someone worth saving in return. The rest of the team filed out, discussing next steps. Isaiah lingered briefly, watching Darius adjust his coat collar in a gesture that seemed more habit than necessity. The words, "Make it count," echoed in his memory, but he held them back. Not yet. Not until he was sure who Darius still was. The city lights twinkled through Isaiah's apartment window as he paced back and forth, phone pressed to his ear. He'd been wrestling with his thoughts since leaving the law office, and finally he'd called the one person who always helped him see clearly. "So, let me get this straight," Tamika said, her voice carrying that familiar mix of skepticism and curiosity. "The man who saved you from that fire 22 years ago is now your client, and you think he might be innocent?" Isaiah sank into his worn leather armchair, running a hand over his face. "I know how it sounds, but something's not adding up, Mika. You should have seen him today. The way he talked about those tenants. There was real pain there." He could practically see Tamika's raised eyebrow through the phone. "And you're sure that's not just what you want to see? Powerful men can wear polished masks, Isaiah. You know that better than most." "I do," Isaiah admitted, thinking back to all the cases he'd handled where wealthy defendants had played the sympathy card perfectly. "But this feels different. The timeline of these charges, the way everything happened while he was dealing with cancer treatment." "Hold up," Tamika interrupted. Her voice shifted, taking on the sharp edge he recognized from her investigative work. "Cancer treatment. When exactly?" "March through December last year. He had surgery, then chemo and radiation. Why?" There was the sound of rapid typing on the other end. "Because timing matters, little brother. Good people can get trapped in bad systems, sure, but sometimes those systems leave paper trails." Isaiah sat up straighter. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "Already pulling up public records," Tamika replied. "Meet me tomorrow at Rosie's Diner. Bring everything you've got on those eviction orders." "You're the best, Mika." Yeah. Just remember you owe me pancakes." The next morning, Isaiah arrived at Rosie's Diner clutching a thick manila envelope. The small establishment was quiet at this hour, with only a few early bird regulars scattered among the worn booths. Tamika was already there, laptop open and coffee cup half empty, her reporter's notebook covered in her characteristic scrawl. "You look like you haven't slept," Isaiah said, sliding into the booth across from her. "Pot, kettle," she shot back, gesturing to the dark circles under his eyes. "But I found some interesting things in the public records. Show me what you've got first." Isaiah spread out the documents while their waitress brought over a fresh pot of coffee and took their order. Tamika insisted on her promised pancakes before diving into the paperwork. "Okay," she said, pulling out a highlighted printout. "Here's what caught my attention. The Brooklyn court evictions were authorized on May 15th. According to hospital records I found, guess where Darius Langford was that day?" Isaiah leaned forward. "Surgery." "Bingo. 8-hour procedure at Memorial West. He was literally under anesthesia when these papers were supposedly signed." Tamika pushed aside her empty plate and grabbed one of the authorization forms. "Let me see his signature on this." They spent the next hour meticulously comparing documents. Isaiah noticed how Tamika's eyes narrowed as she examined each signature, occasionally making notes or taking photos with her phone. "Look at this," she said finally, laying out 4 documents side by side. The signatures are close, but there are inconsistencies. The L in Langford slopes differently on the eviction orders. The pressure points are wrong too. Whoever did this was trying to copy his signature, but they pressed too hard on the downstrokes. Isaiah pulled out his laptop, accessing the case files. "And look at these dates. 4 separate displacement authorizations, all signed when hospital records show he was either in surgery or heavily medicated during treatment." Tamika started a new page in her notebook, writing in clear bullet points. 4 forged displacement authorizations. Missing ledger entries from Langford Foundation's charitable wing. Sudden asset transfers from Darius's personal trust to shell accounts. "Someone used his medical absence as cover," Isaiah said quietly, the pieces falling into place. They knew he'd be out of commission for months. They probably figured by the time he noticed anything wrong, it would be too late. And they were counting on his reputation working against him, Tameka added. Rich white developer accused of displacing low-income tenants? That's an easy story to sell. No one would look too closely at the details. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the discovery settling over them. The morning crowd had thinned out, leaving them almost alone in the diner. Through the window, Isaiah could see the city coming to life, people rushing to work, unaware of the conspiracy they were unraveling in this quiet booth. Tameka closed her notebook and looked at her brother. The morning sun caught the determination in her eyes, the same look she'd had when she'd pushed him to apply to that charter school all those years ago. "You said he told you to make it count, right?" she asked softly. Isaiah nodded, remembering the whispered words that had shaped his life's direction. Then maybe this is how. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of the small conference room, casting thin stripes of light across the polished table. Isaiah stood for a moment outside the door, his hand resting on the handle, steadying his breath. The manila folder felt heavy in one hand, the carefully preserved blazer draped over his other arm. When he entered, Darius was already there, reviewing documents with reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up briefly, offering a professional nod before returning to his papers. The room felt smaller than their previous meeting spaces, more intimate without the buffer of legal teams and assistants. Isaiah closed the door with a soft click. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet space. He placed the manila folder on the table first, then, with deliberate care, laid the blazer beside it. The fabric made a whisper-soft sound against the wood. Darius glanced up again, his eyes moving from the folder to the jacket. For a moment, his expression remained neutral, professional. Then something shifted. His gaze locked onto the blazer, studying its familiar lines, the slight wear at the edges, the careful preservation that had kept it intact for over 2 decades. His breath caught audibly in his throat. "That's..." Darius removed his reading glasses slowly, his hands trembling slightly. "That's impossible." Isaiah pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "You wrapped me in it. In the elevator. During the fire." The color drained from Darius's face as recognition crashed over him. His eyes darted between the jacket and Isaiah's face, seeing for the first time not just the accomplished lawyer before him, but echoes of that small boy from so long ago. "The boy from Southside Towers," Darius whispered. "You're..." "Isaiah Freeman," Isaiah finished quietly. "I was 6 years old. The elevator jammed between floors. My inhaler fell through the grating. The smoke was everywhere." His voice remained steady, but his hands clasped tightly together on the table. "You broke through the doors with a fire extinguisher, wrapped me in your jacket, carried me out." Darius reached out with unsteady fingers, touching the blazer's sleeve. "I remember. The screaming outside. Everyone just standing there, filming on their phones. And inside, that horrible smoke. My mother died that day," Isaiah continued. "She was helping Mrs. Rodriguez from the 5th floor get down the stairs. They found them together." He paused, swallowing hard. "She always taught me to help others, even at the end." The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared memory. "After that, it was foster care," Isaiah said. 6 homes in 12 years. Some good, some not so good. I kept the jacket sealed up, protected. It was the only thing I had from that day besides my sketchbook." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I used to draw you as a superhero, you know, breaking through fire instead of just doors." Darius's shoulders hunched slightly, his voice rough. "I'm no hero. I couldn't stand there doing nothing. But afterward, I thought about finding you, checking if you were okay. I had resources, connections." "But you didn't," Isaiah stated. Not accusatory, just fact. No, Darius admitted. I told myself it wasn't my place, that swooping in with money or influence would just make it about me, not about giving you space to build your own life. He met Isaiah's eyes directly. I read about you, though, over the years. Public defender, civil rights cases, housing advocacy. I never knew it was you. Isaiah nodded slowly. I looked for you too. Found your name in business articles, real estate sections. But I didn't reach out either. I didn't want to be the fire kid. I wanted to make something of myself first, to make it count. Darius's head snapped up at those words. You remember that? It was the last thing I heard before passing out in the ambulance, Isaiah said. Make it count, kid. That's all I ask. Those words shaped everything. My morals, my career choices, my purpose. They became a kind of promise. The morning light had shifted, warming the room. Darius sat back in his chair, something vulnerable crossing his expression. After the fire, he said slowly, I couldn't just go back to business as usual. All those buildings I owned, all those families. I started looking closer at conditions, at safety protocols, but it wasn't enough. He ran a hand through his graying hair. I established the Langford Foundation, anonymously, started funding community housing projects, legal aid programs, emergency response training. It was the only thing that ever felt close to redemption. I know, Isaiah said quietly. My office receives grants from your foundation. We never knew it was you. They sat in silence then, but it wasn't the tense silence of their previous meetings. This silence felt real, like a bridge slowly being built between past and present. Finally, Isaiah reached for the manila folder. He slid it across the table with purpose, his lawyer's demeanor returning, but tempered now with something deeper. Your CFO betrayed you, he said simply. Darius opened the folder, scanning the highlighted sections, the comparison of signatures, the timeline of transactions during his cancer treatment. His jaw tightened as understanding dawned. Glenn, he muttered, while I was in the hospital. Now it's your turn to fight, Isaiah said firmly. Darius looked up from the documents. The defeated weariness that had haunted him since the scandal broke was gone. In its place, a different kind of fire sparked behind his eyes, not the desperate flames of that day long ago, but a steady burn of determination to reclaim what was taken. He nodded once, decisively, and reached for the blazer that had connected their lives across 22 years. The evening light faded through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Darius's condo, casting long shadows across stacks of moving boxes and wrapped furniture. What had once been an elegant penthouse now felt hollow, its warmth packed away, leaving only echoes and empty spaces. Isaiah sat cross-legged on the floor, his suit jacket discarded, tie loosened, as he spread documents across the hardwood in precise patterns. Across from him, Darius leaned against a bare wall, his sleeves rolled up, holding a container of cold Chinese food he'd barely touched. These transactions, Isaiah said, tapping a highlighted section, all happened within 48 hours of your first round of treatment. He shifted another paper forward. And these eviction notices were processed while you were still under post-operative observation. Darius set down his container and picked up one of the documents, squinting at the signature. It looks like mine, close enough to fool most people. His voice was tight. Glenn watched me sign things for 15 years. He knew every quirk, every habit. That's what makes it dangerous, Isaiah replied. He didn't just forge random signatures. He studied you, waited for the perfect moment, and built his plan carefully. He gestured at the surrounding boxes. And now you're being pushed out of your own life. Darius's gaze swept across his half-packed home. I trusted him. With everything. The business, the foundation, my personal accounts. He pressed his fingers to his temples. While I was focusing on just staying alive, he was. systematically dismantling everything you built, Isaiah finished quietly. The buzz of Isaiah's phone cut through the heavy silence. Tamika's name flashed on the screen. He quickly opened her email, eyes scanning rapidly. "She found something," he said, voice sharpening. He turned his laptop around so Darius could see. A confidential memo from Glenn to the board, dated 3 months ago. Darius leaned forward, reading aloud. While Mr. Langford's verbal approval was obtained for all property transitions, his current mental fatigue from ongoing cancer treatments makes written documentation difficult to obtain. His face darkened. That manipulative bastard. "He's covering himself legally while exploiting your illness," Isaiah said, disgust clear in his tone. "Making it look like you were conscious and willing, just too weak to handle paperwork." "I never approved anything," Darius said firmly. "I was barely conscious most days, let alone making property decisions." Isaiah scrolled further, then stopped abruptly. "There's more. Tamika found a payment trail. Glenn paid off someone named Rebecca Cho. A substantial sum transferred through 3 different shell companies." Recognition flashed across Darius's face. "Rebecca was our compliance officer. Smart, detail-oriented. She left suddenly about 6 months ago, right after my second surgery." He frowned. "I always wondered why." "If she was compliance, she would have seen everything," Isaiah said. "Every irregular transaction, every forged document." "And Glenn silenced her," Darius finished grimly. Isaiah stood up, straightening his tie with determined movements. "We need to find her. A first-hand witness who can verify the fraud would break this case wide open." 2 days later, Isaiah pushed open the door of a small bookstore in Queens, a bell chiming softly overhead. The shop was narrow but deep, with towering shelves creating a maze of literary canyons. The air smelled of old paper and coffee from the tiny cafe counter in the corner. Behind that counter, a petite Korean woman in her early 30s was carefully measuring coffee beans. She looked up as Isaiah approached, her movements becoming more guarded. "Rebecca Cho?" he asked quietly. She set down the coffee scoop, her expression carefully neutral. "We're closing soon." "I'm not here about coffee," Isaiah said. "I'm here about Langford Properties." Rebecca's face tightened. "I have nothing to say about that. I signed an agreement." "I know about the payment," Isaiah said, keeping his voice gentle. 3 transfers through shell companies, totaling just over $500,000. Enough to buy silence, but not enough to buy peace of mind. Am I right? She looked away, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "You don't understand what's at stake." "Actually, I do." Isaiah pulled out his phone, showing her a photo of the old blazer. 22 years ago, I was trapped in a burning building. Darius Langford saved my life. He didn't know me, didn't want credit, just did what was right and disappeared. He put the phone away. That's who he really is. The man Glenn Avery is destroying. That's the man who gave a 6-year-old boy a second chance. Rebecca's professional mask cracked slightly. Mr. Langford was always fair, decent. Even when the board pushed for aggressive expansion, he insisted on doing things right. She swallowed hard. "When I found the irregularities in the books, I went to Glenn first. I trusted him to handle it properly." "What happened?" Isaiah asked softly. "He threatened me. Said he had evidence I'd approved previous fraudulent transactions, that I'd go down with everyone else if I didn't take the deal." Her voice shook. "I have a sister with medical debt. I couldn't risk it." "I understand fear," Isaiah said. "I grew up in the foster system after losing my mom. Spent years afraid to trust, to speak up, to take chances." He met her eyes steadily. "But sometimes, staying silent costs more than speaking up." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, absently reorganizing sugar packets. If I came forward, what would happen? We can get you whistleblower immunity, Isaiah assured her. Full protection. Your testimony would be crucial, but you wouldn't face any charges. She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. Glenn has copies of everything, every transaction, every order, every call log. He keeps them in a private safe as insurance. Would you be willing to testify about that? About all of it? Rebecca looked around her tiny bookstore, then back at Isaiah. Something shifted in her expression, fear giving way to resolve. Yes, she said firmly. It's time someone spoke up. Back in his office later that evening, Isaiah stood by his desk, looking at the old blazer draped carefully over his chair. He reached out, touching the worn fabric that had once sheltered a scared little boy from smoke and flame. You gave me protection once, he said quietly. Now it's my turn. The marble halls of the courthouse buzzed with tension as reporters huddled outside, their cameras flashing through the tall windows like distant lightning. Inside, the gallery seats filled quickly with spectators, legal observers, and curious onlookers drawn to the high-profile fraud case that had captured headlines for weeks. Isaiah stood in the quiet anteroom, adjusting his burgundy tie with steady hands. His reflection in the wood-paneled wall showed a man transformed from that scared boy in the elevator, poised, prepared, and purposeful. Beside him, Darius straightened his own navy suit jacket, his silver hair neat, but his face carrying the weight of months under public scrutiny. Ready? Isaiah asked quietly. Darius nodded, his jaw set. Thanks to you. They walked into the courtroom together, not as attorney and client, but as two men bound by an old debt and a shared pursuit of justice. Their footsteps echoed on the polished floor as they made their way to the defense table. Across the aisle, Glenn Avery sat with his legal team, his usual smooth confidence showing hints of strain around the eyes. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." The Superior Court of New York County is now in session, the Honorable Judge Marina Chen presiding. As the proceedings began, Isaiah rose with practiced grace. His opening statement was measured, precise, laying out not just a defense of Darius Langford, but an exposition of calculated betrayal. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed room. "This case is about more than numbers on a page or signatures on documents. It's about the systematic exploitation of trust during a man's most vulnerable moment. We will prove that Mr. Glenn Avery, while serving as Chief Financial Officer of Langford Properties, orchestrated an elaborate scheme of fraud and forgery during Mr. Langford's cancer treatment, not just stealing money, but attempting to steal a legacy built on decades of ethical business practices. The evidence unfolded like a carefully constructed puzzle. Isaiah called their first witness, Rebecca Cho. She walked to the stand with quiet determination, her hands clasped tightly, but her voice clear as she took the oath. "Ms. Cho," Isaiah began, "please tell the court about your position at Langford Properties." "I was the compliance officer from 2018 to 2022, she replied. "My job was to review all major financial transactions and ensure they met both legal requirements and company ethical guidelines." "And what did you discover in early 2022? Rebecca's testimony was devastating in its detail. She described discovering irregularities in transaction approvals, confronting Glenn Avery, and his subsequent threats and bribery. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke about the fake approval timestamps, the forged digital signatures, the careful manipulation of dates to coincide with Darius's hospital stays. "Mr. Avery told me he would destroy my career if I didn't cooperate," she said, looking directly at Glenn. "He said no one would believe me over him anyway." The forensic evidence came next. Isaiah projected detailed analyses onto the courtroom screens, showing how Glenn had used sophisticated software to clone Darius's digital signature. Bank records revealed a complex web of transfers, moving millions from Langford Foundation's charitable accounts through shell companies and finally to offshore accounts controlled by Glenn. During cross-examination, Glenn's attorneys tried to paint Rebecca as a disgruntled employee, but her documentation was too thorough, her testimony too consistent. They attempted to suggest Darius had given verbal approvals, but the hospital records were clear. During many of the transactions in question, he had been heavily sedated after surgery. Then came Darius's testimony. He walked to the stand with dignity, took the oath with clear eyes. Isaiah approached his witness with careful respect. "Mr. Langford, could you tell us about your health crisis in 2022? "Stage 3 colorectal cancer," Darius said simply. "The diagnosis came in February. I underwent 2 major surgeries and 6 months of aggressive chemotherapy. During this time, who did you trust to manage your business affairs?" "Glenn Avery." Darius's voice carried a weight of regret. "He'd been my CFO for 15 years. I trusted him completely with both the company and the foundation while I focused on survival." Isaiah guided him through the timeline of treatments, the periods of incapacitation, the gradual discovery of what had happened in his absence. Darius didn't dodge responsibility. He acknowledged his failure to maintain oversight, his misplaced trust, his absence during crucial decisions. "But I never," he stated firmly, looking directly at the judge, "never approved the displacement of any tenants. I never authorized the transfer of charitable funds, and I never touched a dollar that wasn't legally earned through legitimate business operations." Glenn's defense strategy crumbled under the mountain of evidence. His lawyers attempted to argue that Darius had been a willing participant who was now trying to avoid responsibility, but the timeline made such claims impossible. They tried to suggest mass confusion due to Darius's illness, but the precision of Glenn's forgeries proved careful planning rather than chaos. The final blow came when Isaiah presented evidence that Glenn had been quietly selling off his own properties and moving assets offshore weeks before the scandal broke. Proving he'd known the truth would eventually come out. After 4 days of testimony, Judge Chen's chambers fell silent as she prepared to deliver her ruling. Isaiah felt Darius's shoulder brush against his as they stood for the verdict. Across the aisle, Glenn's confident facade had finally cracked, showing the fear beneath. "In the matter of the state of New York versus Glenn Avery," Judge Chen began, her voice carrying authority and certainty, "this court finds the defendant guilty on all counts of fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. Additionally, all claims against Darius Langford are hereby dismissed with prejudice." She continued with specific findings of fact, but her words were nearly drowned out by the rush of whispers in the gallery. 2 court officers approached Glenn, handcuffs ready. The cameras outside began flashing with renewed intensity as word spread. Darius sat quietly as the judge detailed the verdict. His name was cleared, but the cost was written in the new lines on his face, in the knowledge that his empire had been decimated, his reputation forever marked by association with scandal. Yet as he turned to Isaiah, something in his eyes had lightened, as if the weight of carrying a false guilt had finally lifted. In that moment, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a courtroom in transition, 2 men who had saved each other in different ways shared a look of quiet understanding. No words were needed. The debt was paid. The circle closed. The truth, at last, had found its voice. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site in Southside as Isaiah stood quietly, taking in the nearly completed building before him. The familiar sounds of his old neighborhood filled the air, car horns in the distance, children's laughter, the rhythmic thump of basketballs on concrete. Through gaps in the temporary fencing, kids darted back and forth, turning the construction site into their playground, despite the no trespassing signs. Isaiah smiled as he watched them weave between ladders and pallets, their game of tag transforming the work zone into an obstacle course. Above them, a fresh banner rippled in the breeze. "Coming soon, Promise House, a community-first project by the Latrice Foundation." The letters of his mother's name caught the morning light, making them shine. The building itself was beautiful, modern but welcoming, with warm brick and large windows that would flood the interior with natural light. Solar panels crowned the roof, and a small community garden was already taking shape in the side yard. It wasn't just housing. It was a statement about dignity, about worth, about home. Inside the attached community center, the space hummed with purpose. Darius moved through the main hall with a group of young black architects, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows and blueprints tucked under his arm. His silver hair caught the light from the skylights as he gestured toward various features, explaining the thinking behind each design choice. "See how the common areas flow into private spaces," he said, spreading a blueprint across a folding table. "We wanted to create natural gathering points without sacrificing privacy. Every detail matters when you're building community." The young architects leaned in, asking questions and taking notes. Darius answered each query with patience and insight, sharing not just technical knowledge, but the philosophy behind their approach. He looked more at ease in his work clothes than he ever had in his expensive suits. Meanwhile, Isaiah led a small group of local reporters through the facility. His voice was steady and clear as he outlined the foundation's mission, pointing out spaces designed for specific programs. "This wing will house our legal advocacy center," he explained, gesturing to a series of well-lit offices. "We'll provide free legal support to families facing housing issues, custody battles, and other critical needs." He moved to a large training room equipped with computers. "Here, we'll offer job training specifically designed for former foster youth. Many age out of the system without the skills they need to succeed. We're changing that." The reporters scribbled notes as Isaiah continued the tour, explaining how the building would combine community-owned housing with comprehensive support services. He showed them apartments designed for single-parent families with built-in childcare spaces and flexible floor plans. In her new office, Tamika was already hard at work, surrounded by press releases and policy briefs. As Director of Media and Policy, she'd taken charge of shaping the Foundation's message and advocating for systemic change. She looked up as Isaiah passed by with the reporters, giving him a quick wink. The morning flowed into afternoon as final preparations were made for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Chairs filled the courtyard as community members arrived. Children perched on parents' shoulders, trying to get a better view. The mayor sat in the front row, along with other city officials and community leaders. Isaiah stood at the podium, the old jacket folded neatly in his hands. The fabric was still pristine, preserved through all these years. He looked out at the gathered crowd, at the faces of hope and expectation, at the children who reminded him so much of himself at their age. 22 years ago, he began, his voice carrying across the hushed courtyard. "I almost died in this exact spot. I was 6 years old, trapped in an elevator as fire spread through the building that once stood here." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "Someone ran into that fire to save me. He didn't ask who I was or who I might become. He didn't calculate the risk or worry about his own safety. He just made sure I had a chance." Isaiah's eyes found Darius in the crowd, standing quietly at the back. That chance became everything. It became education, purpose, and eventually this moment right here. But the truth I learned along the way is that we don't become anything alone. Every one of us needs someone to run into the fire for us, to believe in us, to give us that chance. He held up the jacket. "This belonged to the man who saved me. For years, I kept it as a reminder of what I owed. Now I understand it wasn't about debt. It was about connection, about responsibility to each other, about making sure every child has someone willing to run into the fire for them." Isaiah walked down from the podium and approached Darius. Without words, he handed over the jacket. Darius took it with careful hands, his eyes bright with emotion. Together, they walked to the foundation stone of the building. Darius folded the jacket one last time and placed it gently beside the stone. The ribbon was cut to thunderous applause. As the doors opened, children rushed into the lobby, their excited voices echoing off new walls. Parents followed more slowly, taking in the spaces that would become their homes. Community leaders explored the facilities, already planning programs and partnerships. Isaiah stood at the entrance, greeting each person who entered. His eyes held that same quiet fire they'd always carried, but now it burned with fulfillment rather than memory. Behind him, Darius watched from a distance, a small smile on his face as he witnessed the transformation of tragedy into triumph, of loss into legacy. Promise House was more than a building rising from old ashes. It was proof that purpose could heal pain, that community could rebuild what time had broken, and that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism were not in running into fires, but in making sure no one had to face them alone. If you enjoyed the story of Darius and Isaiah, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.